Hi guys, today we're going to talk about changing back and forth between percents, fractions, and decimals. And all the skills that we're working on in this unit are leading us up to the learning goal. I can solve real-world problems involving percents, including simple interest, tax, tips, discount, commission, markup, and percent of increase or decrease. It's really important to remember what the definition of percent is when we're thinking about how fractions, decimals, and percents relate to each other. So percent means out of 100. Per out of cent is a word that means hundred or hundredth actually. So think about the fact that there are 100 cents in a dollar. So 1 cent is 100th of a dollar, and percent is using that root word of cent as hundredth, and then per we know means out of. So it either means, you can think of it as out of 100, or you can think of it as how many hundredths that a number contains. So that's really important when we're thinking about how fractions, decimals, and percents are related to each other. So let's look at this 10 by 10 grid that we have here on the left. I can see that there are 34 squares shaded in. And so we know from our work in the packet that we did that 34 squares out of 100 would be 34%. And so I could write that 34% of that unit square is shaded in. But I could also very easily think about that in terms of either a fraction, or a decimal, because I know that 34 squares out of 100 are shaded in. So I could write that as 34 out of 100. So 34 hundredths as a fraction or a ratio. You could think of it as a ratio too, because I'm comparing the amount of shaded in squares to the total amount of squares. So that's also a ratio. And then once I have a fraction that's written as hundredths, that's very easy to translate to a decimal, or knowing that percent means number of hundredths, I can write that easily as a decimal because I know that the hundredths place is the second place after the decimal point there. That's the hundredths place. And so if I want to write 34 hundredths, I would just make sure that the 4 was in the hundredths place. So you can see that knowing that relationship and that meaning of the word percent being hundredths or out of 100 helps us to translate back and forth between fractions, decimals, and percents. Now notice that this fraction, 34 hundredths, is not in simplest form. I could simplify it by dividing both the numerator and the denominator by 2 and write that as 17 over 50. And so it's important to know that not all fractions are written as hundredths, but that we can change a fraction, or we can take any fraction and write it as a percent if we figure out how many hundredths it is. So either by changing it to a decimal and looking at the hundredths that way, or by writing or finding an equivalent fraction that has 100 in the denominator, which you can't do with all fractions, but you can do with some. So let's look at an example here. In a slice of cheese pizza, 45 calories are from fat. The total number of calories in each slice is 158. So we want to think about the ratio of calories from fat to the calories from the whole slice and express that as a fraction, a decimal, and a percent. So here we're looking at a ratio. And remember, when we want to write a ratio, we want to put the numbers in the order that it tells us to. So it says to do fat to whole slice. So I know the calories from fat are 45. And the calories from the whole slice are 158. There's a ratio. If I want to write that ratio as a fraction, I'm just going to put 45 over 158. And it looks to me like that is in simplest form. So now I want to express that as a decimal. I'm going to use my calculator, and we'll do 45 divided by 158, because remember, this is just a division problem. And so you can see that that is a repeating decimal. So if I want to write that as a decimal, I think I'm going to round to let's round to the thousandths place. So that would be 0.2 0.84. The 4 is in the thousands place, and there's an 8 after that 4, which tells me to have the 4 go up 1, so I would write that as 0.285. Now that I have my fraction written as a rounded decimal, I can easily change this to a percent, because remember that percent means out of 100, or how many hundredths. So I need to look at this and think about how many hundredths I have. Well, I have 28 hundredths, because remember, the hundredths place is the second place after the decimal point. So what I'm essentially doing when I'm writing a decimal as a percent is I'm really just thinking about moving my decimal point over so that it's after the hundredths place, 2 places to the right. So if I wanted to write this as a percent, I would write it as 28.5%, because I have 28 hundredths, and then I have 5 thousandths, which is the same as half of 1/100th. So 28.5%. Now, this is important. A lot of times people get confused when they see a percent like this that has a decimal point in it, and they want to say that's a decimal number. It's not. Decimal numbers are written in our decimal system, and they're different from percents. Even though that number has a decimal point in it, it is a percent because it has a percent sign after it. So if I ask you to change 28.5% to a decimal, you don't just write 28.5 and take the percent sign off. Those two numbers are not equivalent, because remember, the percent is telling us how many hundredths, and when we write it as a decimal, we're changing it back to be in our regular decimal system, not how many hundredths. This would be 0.285. So you have to change any number with a percent sign in it by moving the decimal point 2 places to the left when you change it to a decimal, even if there's already a decimal point in that number. Okay, that's really, really important. An elephant eats about 6% of its body weight in vegetation each day. So what if I want to take that 6% and express it, think about what it is as a fraction, and then also what it would be as a decimal? Well, it's pretty easy to think about changing a percent to a decimal again, because remember that percent means how many hundredths. So, or out of 100, and that's going to help us write this as both a fraction and a decimal. So if I want to write 6% as a decimal, I need to say that I have 6 hundredths. So the 6 needs to be in the hundredths place after the decimal point. Well, that's the second place after the decimal point. So if I want that to be in the second place, I need to put a 0 in front of it and a decimal point in front of that, which if you think about taking 6%, that's the same as moving my decimal point 2 places to the left and then putting in a 0 right there. So 6%, 6 hundredths, same thing. So I would write this as the decimal 6 hundredths. Remember, 6% also means 6 out of 100. So that helps me to think about how I would write it as a fraction. 6 out of 100. That's a fraction, but it's not in simplest form. So anytime I look at a fraction, I want to think about, is it in simplest form? Could I simplify it? I could divide these two numbers by 2 and write that as 3/50. And then that is in simplest form because 3 and 50 don't share any factors other than 1. The answer to the free response question for today is telephone call. Here are your free response and multiple choice questions. So go ahead, pause the video now, and have a fabulous day when you're done watching this.